Right. Okay. So I can't remember when the building was built at all.
4 years ago.
It was built 4 years ago. And how much use do you get out of it at the moment?
Pretty well everything that is put on here gets booked out solidly.
Well,
So they run the astronomy group that runs the observatory runs 4 or 5 events a week at this time of year, because it's a very good time of year for observing, and on the whole they'll be either full or nearly full, all of them.
That's cool. And how many people do you have? Can you get in sort of if you were doing a public event?
Well, what they tend to do is that they will set the kind of numbers that are in here at a particular a particular number that provides for a good visitor experience. So that's probably something like 35 people, but there'll probably be about 4 people running the event. So by the time you break down 35 people into 4 groups maybe, then you've got quite a small number in each group. And the intent as always was to create a kind of personalised experience. Yeah.
That's cool. And do you have there sort of permanent people that work here on a kind of permanent basis that would come up? I don't know, sort of scientists in residence, I'd like to say, but
not really. Well, there's amateur astronomy. Amateur astronomy breaks down into kind of quite well people who kind of like to kind of do it, and people who are fairly high end, indistinguishable from professionals really. So the people that run the astronomy group here are in that kind of latter camp really. So they're very, very knowledgeable, and there's not really any difference, I suppose, what I'm saying, between the people that run it and the people that you're trying, sort of describing.
Yeah.
But there isn't a permanent, like you can't come up here, it's not open all the time because somebody's sitting there being a permanent artist, astronomer in residence.
Yeah.
But what happens is that when the public go home, the astronomy group then. What happens is that when the public go home, the astronomers tend to hang on, and they might well be here right through the middle of the night.
Yeah.
So they're a pretty hardy bunch, and will do whatever they deem fit to get what they want out of it. So
that's cool.
there are also quite a lot of private bookings of the observatory. So as well as the public program, there's a bunch of people that will just ring up and say, I'd like to bring my whatever group up here, or it's my wedding anniversary, or whatever, the whole range of reasons why people do it, and they'll just simply book the thing for the night. So they might be quite, they might be astronomically minded, or they might just be romantics,
Yeah.
And the other thing that they do is that they bring in visiting speakers. So they'll, like last night, they had somebody here, talking about comets and things. So.
That's cool. How
Julia goes past.
Yeah.
Cheap form of warmth.
How would you say the building performs in terms of what was sort of required of it, and what's actually happened?
Do you mean once we settled on the design? Did it? How did what we actually built perform against?
What you envisaged originally, and what you have now. I mean, how is that?
Well, when we built when we were thinking about the design of the building, we went through various phases of thinking about what its purpose was, and it certainly started out as being the idea that we could have an interesting architectural enclosure for a single telescope. That's the very root of the project. But quite quickly we realised that if we wanted to run it like a public access program, then it had to be bigger than that. And the idea about having 2 telescopes came out of discussions with Durham University, and about how they felt that astronomy centre might work. And if the key to the longevity of it is building up a sort of social network, who use it, so and a loyalty to it. So if you've got a too small a group working with it, the problem is that if you lose 1 or 2 key people, the whole thing can disappear. Whereas if you can build it and have the capacity to kind of accommodate more people, then it's more likely to attract more people and more likely to kind of last over the years. So that resulted in both an idea that we needed to have a group size that was aimed at about a school group size, so that you could bring, you know, your average class size, 30 odd people up here with helpers, and that determined the size of the warm room, which is, you know, the kind of social area in there, and the layout of it was determined partly by the advice of astronomers and about what they might want to do. The way it's laid out was decided by the architect, but he worked with an astronomer on his design work. So by the time it got to the final design ready to be built, it had gone through a lot of both technical and specialised sort of, you know, nitpicking to kind of work out, you know, to agree that actually it was a thing that was going to fulfil what they thought it was going to fulfil. And having said that, I think the only things that really haven't performed like that are the shutters in the end turret, which have been kind of mechanically a bit kind of problematic through, but that's not, you know, it's a kind of a fault of the, you know, the gauge of the hinges and things like that, you know, which will get resolved in the end, but it's not an issue about the overall usage of it.
That's cool. And how do you feel the building sits in the landscape? From a personal opinion, how would you feel the building sits in the landscape? And you know, do you think it? Sorry.
I can talk a little bit about the way it kind of sits at the moment.
If
you know, when it was so when it was designed, it was obviously intended to be a wooden building. When it was built, it was a very bright kind of reddish timber colour, and it softened into the landscape, into the sort of background landscape as we knew it would over the years. If you leave timber in this sort of landscape, it tends to oxidise on its surface, so most of the timber that's lying around in the landscape goes a sort of silvery grey, and the observatory is also doing that, although it on the western side of it, which is what we're looking at behind me here, it tends to kind of gather a bit of kind of greenery because it's the wettest side of the building. So it's certainly kind of changed over the 4 years it's been here so far. You know, in terms of how it was intended to sit in the landscape generally, you know, the design of the angles of the roof and the skirt line of it kind of mimic the gradients of the hills, both that it sits on and that lie behind it. So that makes a difference to it, you know, how it kind of feels within the landscape. But one of the interesting things, you know, about it is that the landscape changed around it. So until about a year ago, as you approached the observatory from lower down the hill, the observatory was always seen against a backdrop of very mature trees, which lie, you know, over in this direction. So it was framed and sat against those trees, and then they felled them all. So at a stroke, it went from being an observatory that looked like it sat in front of things with a hill behind it to an observatory it isn't actually sitting on top of the hill, but it certainly feels like it's out in a big open space. And then over the long term, there's a planting plan which is already in place, which determines what sort of species of trees are going to grow up around it and how close they'll be allowed to get to it. So in 20 or 30 years' time, it'll sit in a kind of like big clearing, really, where the trees can't kind of interfere with its purpose, but it'll look different again. So it's, you know, the landscape here is thought about very considerably over quite a long periods of time. So it's an interesting, you know, area.
With the use of materials, is the wood used in the building local, or whereabouts has it been?
Most of what you see is Siberian larch, and the timber for the building was chosen primarily for longevity and ease of lack of maintenance, really, so that when you get the funding for a project like this, the chances are that you are going to get, you know, you're asking for a fair amount of money, and you tend to ask, if at that point in time, you might well ask for a bit more money to be able to use the best quality materials you can lay your hands on, and that translates into less maintenance, less problem, you know, 10, 20 years down the line, when it's actually impossible to get funding, you know, to do that. So you're asking more of your funders at the beginning to save yourself kind of bills later on. So the criteria for this was that all the timber, knowing that it wasn't going to come from Kielder, which produces a different sort of timber really for what we needed, it all had to come from what's called FSC certified sources, which is Forestry Stewardship Council sources. So it's basically a way of looking at timber production from a kind of an ethical standpoint, so that you know, if it came from I don't know, like, South America, let's say, that it was being produced under certain conditions that were kind of advantageous to the people that lived there, or it wasn't damaging the environment, or it was on a sustainable kind of production in the locations it came from, and that sort of criteria that were being used.
Cool. Sorry, I understand I'm taking a bit of your time. With I don't know, what else can I ask?
Last chance.
Yeah, I don't know what to say. Is there anything interesting? Sorry, anything really interesting about the building that I?
Well, I mean, in terms of interesting, the way it's built is kind of intriguing in as much as it's designed to look slightly ambiguous. It's designed to look as it looks now, as in its lockdown form, not specifically like an observatory, and that's intended to avoid the look of something being too scientific, because as a visitor to the place, we wanted people, the general public, to feel like it's a welcoming place, not a place for specialists that they weren't supposed to be there. So that's part of it. And from a technical point of view, it looks like a continuous structure, but it isn't. So the main bulk of the building is a sort of fairly straightforward timber structure with uprights and lintels and things, but the far end of the building, which looks like the cladding makes it look like an extension of that, is a stress skin box that stands on 4 legs, with a very hefty turret on top of it, and it's cantilevered out in 2 directions, so it's technically quite difficult to make it like that. Probably more difficult than it needs to be, but it's partly to do with trying to make sure that the concept from the architect in the beginning was carried right the way through. So it felt a little bit precarious at times, and slightly off balance, but kind of sort of warm and welcoming at the same time. Kind of interesting mix of things that he's tried to do with it.
It was a great building. Looks great. Sits in the landscape really well. And you're right. It does make it much more inviting. It's weird how that changes it in such a massive way just by changing the design.
I think.
So shall I let you go?
I'm going to have to go.
Yeah,
I mean, what they said was that when it's locked down like this, it looks like ambiguous but kind of welcoming. But the moment you rotate the turrets or open the shutters, it looks very purposeful and active. Yes.
Sorry.